In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships entered the harbor of Messina, Sicily. These merchant vessels were returning from the Crimean port of Caffa, where Italian merchants owned prosperous trading posts and conducted trade with the East. But this time, the ships carried not only silk and spices, they carried death. When the Genoese sailors disembarked, the inhabitants of Messina saw something horrifying. Many of the arrivals were covered in festering sores, weakened by fever, and coughing up blood. A few days after the ship's arrival, the first townspeople began to exhibit the same terrible symptoms. The Franciscan friar Michel da Piazza, describing events 10 years later, recounted how the disease swept through the city with unprecedented speed. The sick developed painful swellings in the groin or armpits, buboes, which could grow to the size of an apple or an egg. The ill suffered from high fever, chills, and headaches. They were nauseated and intolerant of light. Some lost consciousness, raved, and were unable to sleep. Their gait became unsteady, their speech slurred. Others developed a terrible cough with bloody sputum, their lungs filled with fluid, leading to suffocation. Many died within hours or days. The terrified residents of Messina quickly understood that the source of the disaster was the Genoese ships. A crowd of townspeople forcibly expelled the sick sailors from the port. Their ships were driven out of the harbor, but it was too late. The disease spread among the town's population, and death began to reap its harvest. Desperate, the residents of Messina fled the city, hoping to find safety in villages and other settlements. However, the fugitives themselves carried the contagion with them, spreading it throughout Sicily. When refugees from Messina arrived in the city of Catania, they were initially met with compassion, but soon, the inhabitants of Catania realized that their guests had brought a deadly disease with them. The city authorities immediately imposed strict controls on people's movement, trying to prevent the spread of the epidemic. The people of Messina considered the Catanians cruel and heartless, while the latter believed their actions were necessary for self-preservation. The Archbishop of Catania even attempted to expel the plague through divine intervention, bringing water consecrated by the relics of Saint Agatha, the patron saint of Catania, to Messina. However, neither prayers nor holy water could halt the spread of the disease. From Sicily, the plague quickly spread to mainland Italy and other Mediterranean lands. In January 1348, the disease reached Genoa and Venice, the largest trading cities. Simultaneously, the epidemic engulfed Tunis, Corsica, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and the Iberian Peninsula. The trade routes that had brought prosperity to Mediterranean cities for centuries now became channels for the spread of a deadly contagion. No one in Europe could have foreseen that these ships and barges would become the harbingers of the greatest catastrophe in the continent's history. The story of the plague's appearance in Caffa is shrouded in legend, but most sources agree on one point. The disease came from the east during military operations. In 1345 and 1346, the city was besieged by the Golden Horde army under the command of Khan Zenebek. An epidemic of plague broke out among the Mongol soldiers, primarily Tatars. The Genoese notary Gabriele de Mussi claimed that the Khan ordered the corpses of soldiers who had died of illness to be catapulted over the city walls, intentionally attempting to infect the fortress defenders. The terrible biological warfare of the Middle Ages achieved its goal. Genoese merchants, overcome with horror at the spreading epidemic, boarded their ships and sailed home, carrying the disease to European ports. However, it is quite likely that the infection occurred in a more prosaic way. Infected rats could have penetrated the siege lines into the city. Black rats and the fleas that lived on them were the true carriers of the disease. Although medieval people were unaware of this, rats traveled on ships along with cargo, hid in bales of goods, and nested in the holds. When a ship docked, the rodents would come ashore along with sailors and merchants, populating new cities and spreading the plague further. By the spring of 1347, the disease was already raging in Crimea and Constantinople. The entire eastern Mediterranean region began to descend into chaos. In the same year, the plague advanced eastward. In April, it reached Gaza. In July, it reached Damascus. In October, it broke out in Aleppo. In the territories of modern Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, the disease affected the cities of Ascalon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, and Homs. In 1348 and 1349, the epidemic reached Antioch. The inhabitants of the city fled north in panic, but most of the fugitives died on the road from the very disease they were trying to escape. Within 2 years, The plague had spread throughout the Islamic world. From Arabia across all of North Africa, Europe found itself caught in a deadly grip. From the south, the disease advanced through Italy and Spain. From the east, it penetrated through Constantinople and the Balkans. The trade links that made European cities wealthy now became a network ensnaring the continent with death. No quarantines, no travel bans could stop the spread of the epidemic. The Black Death began its relentless journey across Europe, and years of unprecedented horror and devastation awaited the continent. In 1348, the plague struck France and Spain with unprecedented force. The disease knew no borders and recognized no state boundaries. It traveled with merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and refugees, spreading along the roads and maritime routes of medieval Europe. Port cities suffered first. Marseille, Barcelona, Valencia, one after another, plunged into the nightmare of the epidemic. Florence, the Pearl of Tuscany, lost 3/4 of its population. Provence lost half its inhabitants. In the spring and summer of 1348, the plague penetrated deep into the European continent. Germany, Switzerland, and Austria faced the epidemic almost simultaneously. The disease spared neither the poor nor the rich, neither the young nor the old. In August of the same year, a ship from Calais brought the plague to the English port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. This marked the beginning of a catastrophe for the British Isles. By 1349, London found itself at the epicenter of the epidemic. The capital of the kingdom turned into a city of the dead and dying. The speed of the disease's spread astonished contemporaries. In 5 years, from 1347 to 1351, the Black Death engulfed almost all of Europe. Paris, one of the continent's largest cities, suffered alongside others. By 1350, the plague had reached Scandinavia and northern England. Even remote and sparsely populated areas did not escape the terrible fate. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the harsh northern kingdoms also bowed their heads before the invisible enemy. Densely populated cities bore the heaviest losses. In Florence, London, and Paris, 50 to 60% of the inhabitants died. In some medieval cities, mortality reached 80%. Entire quarters became empty. Houses stood with their doors ajar, from which no one emerged anymore. The streets filled with corpses. There were so many that the living could not bury the dead in time. Traditional Christian burial rites became impossible. Bodies were piled in mass graves in enormous heaps, barely covered with earth, and sometimes simply left to rot where death found them. The manifestations of the disease varied from place to place and from case to case. In one village, the plague destroyed the entire community, leaving not a single soul alive. In another place, only 1 or 2 people died, while the rest of the inhabitants remained healthy. There were families where all members died within 24 hours, but there were also cases where the father died on one day, the child 3 weeks later, another child a month later, and then the disease receded. This unpredictability made the plague even more terrifying. It was impossible to predict who it would spare and who it would take. Medieval doctors were powerless against the epidemic. They did not understand the true nature of the disease and could not offer effective treatment. The medicine of the 15th century was based on ancient concepts of the 4 humors of the body and miasmas, poisonous vapors that were believed to poison the air and cause illness. Doctors recommended avoiding foul-smelling places, fumigating rooms with incense, and wearing sachets of aromatic herbs. Some doctors wore strange masks, with long beaks filled with fragrant substances, believing this would protect them from contagion. But all these measures proved useless. Bloodletting, cauterization, various concoctions and ointments, nothing helped to stop the plague. The sick died despite all the efforts of the healers. Moreover, doctors themselves often became victims of the epidemic, caring for the sick and exposing themselves to mortal danger. Many medics fled the plague-ridden cities, fearing for their own lives. This caused anger and despair among the population, which felt abandoned in its hour of greatest need. The church also proved powerless in the face of disaster. Priests died alongside parishioners, fulfilling their duty and administering the last rites to the dying. In some areas, the clergy suffered particularly heavy losses because priests were in constant contact with the sick and dying. Monasteries and abbeys, where monks lived in close quarters, became centers of mass infection. Entire monastic communities disappeared within weeks. The shortage of clergy became so acute that the church was forced to accelerate the training of new priests. lowering the requirements for candidates. Young, inexperienced clerics, barely ordained, were sent to serve in the depleted parishes. Prayers and processions did not stop the epidemic. People prayed to patron saints, ordered masses, made vows, but the plague continued to mow down the ranks of believers. This led to a deep religious crisis. Many began to doubt God's mercy and the justice of divine providence. If God allows such suffering, if prayers remain unanswered, then what is the meaning of faith? These questions tormented medieval people, undermining the foundations of their worldview. On the other hand, some saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. Preachers called for repentance, asserting that only sincere remorse and correction could appease an angered God. This idea led to the emergence of the flagellant movement, groups of people who publicly whipped themselves, seeking to atone for the sins of all humanity. Crowds of flagellants moved from town to town, performing public acts of self-flagellation, accompanied by prayers and psalm singing. They believed that their voluntary suffering could avert God's wrath and stop the plague. Both secular and ecclesiastical authorities viewed the flagellant movement with suspicion. These wandering groups were outside the control of the official church, preaching their own understanding of repentance and salvation. The flagellants began to criticize the clergy, asserting that priests were unable to protect their flock from the plague. Some flagellant groups preached radical ideas bordering on heresy. Ultimately, Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement, and the authorities began to persecute its participants. But at the peak of the epidemic, thousands of people saw self-flagellation as the only hope for salvation. It is impossible to calculate the exact number of victims of the Black Death. Medieval Europe did not keep precise population statistics, but all sources agree that the losses were catastrophic. According to various estimates, from 1347 to 1353, 25 to 50 million people died in Europe. This constituted 30 to 50% of the continent's population. A third of Europe disappeared in a few years. The scale of the tragedy was unprecedented in history. Some regions suffered more than others. Italy, especially the northern areas, incurred enormous losses. Florence, Siena, Pisa, Genoa, Venice, all these wealthy trading cities became desolate. Chroniclers report deserted streets, abandoned houses, fields left unplowed. In Florence, according to contemporary accounts, about 100,000 people died in a few months. In 1348, the city, which was the center of Renaissance culture and art, turned into a kingdom of the dead. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, left a stunning description of the epidemic in the preface to his Decameron. He recounted how the dying were abandoned by their own relatives, how parents refused to care for their sick children out of fear of infection. Traditional social ties were destroyed. People, driven by the instinct of self-preservation, avoided any contact with the sick. Houses where at least one person was ill were marked with a cross, and their inhabitants were completely isolated. Many died alone, without last comfort, without Christian rites. The cities of medieval Europe were an ideal environment for the spread of the epidemic. Narrow streets, cramped living conditions, unsanitary conditions, dense population. All this contributed to the rapid spread of the disease. Several generations of the same family often lived in one house. They slept in the same rooms and used common utensils. When one family member fell ill, all the others became infected. Rats moved freely through houses, hid in basements and attics, and bred in the refuse that townspeople threw directly into the street. Fleas, carriers of the plague bacillus, easily found new victims in the cramped medieval dwellings. Villages and the countryside also did not escape the disaster. Entire settlements disappeared from the face of the earth. Their inhabitants perished to the last person. Lands remained uncultivated. Harvests were not gathered. Livestock died without supervision. Peasants fleeing the plague spread the disease further, infecting other villages. Some tried to hide in forests, hoping that isolation would save them. But even there, the disease caught up with the fugitives. The survivors returned to deserted villages and found only dead bodies and devastation. Europe's economic life came to a standstill. Trade practically ceased. Merchants feared to travel. Ports were closed for quarantine, and fairs were canceled. Craft workshops became empty because masters and apprentices died or fled the cities. Production was reduced to a minimum. Food prices rose sharply due to the shortage of labor in agriculture. At the same time, prices for luxury goods and clothing fell. There was no one to buy them and no one to sell them. Many wealthy merchants were ruined. Their goods remained unclaimed. The shortage of labor became one of the main consequences of the epidemic. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated, there was a lack of land, and peasants lived in poverty under the yoke of feudal lords. After the Black Death, the situation changed dramatically. There was a catastrophic shortage of labor, and surviving peasants found themselves in an advantageous position. They could demand higher wages for their work, better living conditions, and greater freedom. Feudal lords, facing a shortage of workers, were forced to make concessions that were previously unthinkable. Landowners offered peasants more favorable lease terms, reduced or canceled traditional duties, and paid monetary wages instead of in-kind dues. Serfdom began to weaken. Peasants gained the opportunity to leave their lords' lands and seek better conditions in other estates or in cities. Many came to deserted cities where they could find work and start a new life. The traditional feudal system, based on attaching peasants to the land and personal dependence on the lord, began to collapse. Authorities attempted to counter these changes. In England, the Statute of Labourers was passed in 1351, which prohibited demanding and paying wages higher than those existing before the plague. Similar laws were introduced in France and other countries, but these attempts to preserve the old order proved futile. Economic reality was stronger than laws. Employers secretly offered higher wages to attract workers. Peasants ignored prohibitions and moved to those lords who offered better conditions. Social tension escalated. The aristocracy tried to preserve its privileges and prevent the erosion of the traditional hierarchy. Nobles began to dress even more luxuriously and extravagantly, emphasizing their high status and distancing themselves from the rising lower classes. Sumptuary laws were enacted, prohibiting commoners from wearing certain types of clothing, jewelry, and using expensive fabrics. But these measures only exacerbated the conflict between the estates. Richened by trade and crafts, townspeople began to demand higher social status. They bought land, built luxurious houses, and sought to intermarry with the nobility. Financial differences between the estates began to blur, which caused alarm among the traditional aristocracy. The social structure of medieval society, which seemed unshakable, began to change under the influence of the economic shifts caused by the plague. The dissatisfaction of the lower strata of society erupted into a series of revolts and uprisings. In 1358, a peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie broke out in France. Enraged peasants stormed castles, killed nobles, and took revenge for centuries of oppression. The uprising was brutally suppressed, but it showed that the old order could no longer be maintained by force alone. In 1378, uprisings of the urban poor and artisans, deprived of rights in the guild system, occurred in European cities. The social and economic structure of Europe changed irreversibly. In the face of incomprehensible and deadly danger, people desperately sought an explanation for what was happening. The medieval mind demanded to find the cause of the disaster, to understand why the heavens had unleashed such a terrible punishment upon Europe. Many saw the plague as a manifestation of divine wrath for humanity's sins. Preachers from church pulpits denounced the vices of their contemporaries: greed, lust, pride, luxury. They called for repentance and a change in life, promising that only sincere remorse could appease an angered God. But abstract explanations were not enough for people. They wanted to find concrete culprits, those who brought the plague, who poisoned the air and water, who deliberately spread the disease. Amidst an atmosphere of universal fear and panic, rumors and accusations began to spread. Suspicion fell upon those who had always been outsiders in Christian Europe, the Jews. Anti-Semitic sentiments, already strong in medieval society, reached their peak during the plague epidemic. Jews became scapegoats. Ominous rumors spread through cities and villages that Jews were deliberately poisoning wells to destroy Christians. These accusations were absurd. Jews themselves died from the plague, just like Christians, but fear and hatred do not need logic. A complex notion spread that Jews suffered less from the disease due to their observance of hygiene practices or their avoidance of communal wells. In reality, if there was any difference in the incidence rate, it could be explained by the fact that many Jews preferred not to use communal city wells due to discrimination and segregation. Jews began to be arrested and tortured, demanding confessions of well poisoning. Under torture, people confessed to anything, confirming the most absurd accusations. These forced confessions were used as proof of guilt and spread throughout Europe, fueling hatred. Pogroms began. Jewish quarters were attacked by enraged mobs. Houses were looted and burned. People were killed without trial. On the 1st of March 1349, the Jewish community of Worms experienced a devastating pogrom. Accused of spreading the plague, Jews were attacked. The Jewish quarter and the synagogue were set on fire. Contemporary sources report that over 400 community members perished. Many chose to set their own homes on fire to avoid forced baptism. This was just one of many tragedies that befell Jewish communities in Europe during the Black Death. Similar pogroms swept across Germany, France, Switzerland, and Spain. In Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, Basel, Jewish communities were almost completely destroyed. Thousands of people died, their property was looted, and synagogues were demolished. Pope Clement VI tried to stop the wave of violence, issuing a bull in which he pointed out that Jews themselves were suffering from the plague and could not be its perpetrators. He urged Christians not to believe rumors and not to raise their hand against innocent people. But the Pope's voice was too weak amid mass hysteria. Some rulers tried to protect Jews. Understanding the absurdity of the accusations, King Peter IV of Aragon issued a decree threatening severe punishment to those who attacked Jews. King Casimir the Great of Poland granted refuge to Jewish refugees from Germany, providing them with protection and relative safety. Thanks to this, Poland became one of the centers of Jewish culture in subsequent centuries, but such rulers were a minority. Most authorities either condoned the pogroms or even encouraged them, using the situation to write off debts to Jewish creditors and confiscate their property. The persecution of Jews during the Black Death became one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. This wave of violence long undermined the Jewish presence in Western Europe. Many communities were completely destroyed and did not recover. Survivors settled in the East, in Poland and Lithuania, where conditions were more tolerant. The geography of Jewish settlement in Europe changed, and the consequences of these changes were felt well into the 20th century. But Jews were not the only victims of the scapegoat hunt. Leprous individuals, poor wanderers, foreigners, anyone who seemed alien and suspicious, also fell under suspicion. In some places, doctors and pharmacists were accused, claiming they deliberately spread the disease to profit from selling medicines. Groups of fanatics attacked the homes of the wealthy, accusing the nobility of bringing down God's wrath with their luxury and debauchery. Mass hysteria generated the most absurd theories. Some blamed astrological phenomena for the plague. Unfavorable planetary alignments, comets, eclipses. Doctors and scientists of that time seriously discussed the role of miasmas, poisonous vapors emanating from swamps, decaying refuse, and excrement. It was believed that these miasmas poisoned the air and caused illness. Hence the recommendations: avoid foul-smelling places, fumigate rooms with aromatic substances, carry fragrant herbs and spices. The medical faculty of Paris, one of the most authoritative in Europe, prepared an official report on the causes of the plague. It spoke of the conjunction of the three highest planets in the sign of Aquarius, which occurred on the 20th of March 1345. This celestial phenomenon, according to the learned men, caused decay and evaporation in the seas and on Earth, which led to the poisoning of the air and the emergence of the epidemic. The report contained many scholarly disquisitions, references to ancient authorities, astrological calculations, but the theoretical findings had no practical benefit. The true nature of the plague remained a mystery. The causative agent of the disease, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, was discovered only in 1894 by the Swiss-French bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin. Until then, humanity did not understand that the disease was caused by microscopic organisms transmitted by fleas living on rodents. Medieval people saw no connection between rats, fleas, and the plague. They looked for explanations in the realms of morality, religion, and astrology, but not in biology. Ignorance and fear led to terrible consequences. Instead of fighting the real carriers of the disease, rats and fleas, people directed their anger at the innocent. Instead of isolating the sick and observing basic hygiene, they organized mass processions and gatherings where the disease spread even faster. Religious fanaticism, superstitions, and prejudices all hindered the development of a rational strategy to combat the epidemic. Nevertheless, some practical measures were still taken. In the Italian city-states, quarantines began to be introduced. Venice, in 1348, was the first to implement a system of isolating arriving ships. Ships had to remain at anchor for a 40-day quarantine, from the Italian quarantena giorni, 40 days, before the crew and passengers were allowed to disembark. This measure proved effective and gradually spread to other ports. Thus, from the experience of the Black Death, the practice of quarantine was born, which is still used in epidemiology today. Cities began to pay more attention to street cleanliness, garbage removal, and the burial of dead animals. Authorities tried to control the movement of people, especially beggars and vagrants, who were considered carriers of the infection. The sick were isolated, their houses were marked, and healthy people were forbidden to enter them. These measures were imperfect and not always consistent, but they laid the foundation for a future public health system. The economic consequences of the Black Death proved to be profound and long-lasting. The epidemic not only claimed millions of lives, it overturned the entire economic system of medieval Europe. Before the plague, the continent had experienced a period of overpopulation. There was a lack of land, peasants lived in poverty, and feudal lords could dictate any terms, knowing that there was always an abundance of labor. After the epidemic, the situation changed dramatically. The shortage of labor became the main factor determining economic development for decades to come. Surviving peasants and artisans suddenly discovered that their labor had become much more valuable. Employers competed for workers, offering higher wages and better conditions. Traditional feudal obligations, corvée labor, manorial dues, and various in-kind payments began to be replaced by monetary payments. This was a crucial step in the transition from a subsistence economy to a monetary economy. Peasants, receiving money for their labor, could buy goods in the market, which stimulated trade and the development of urban crafts. Serfdom, the foundation of the feudal system, began to collapse. Peasants gained the opportunity to leave their lords' lands and seek better conditions elsewhere. Some migrated to cities, where the shortage of labor was even more acute than in the countryside. Cities offered not only higher wages but also personal freedom. The medieval rule stated, "City air makes you free." A serf who has lived in a city for a year and a day automatically becomes a free person. Landowners found themselves in a difficult situation. Their estates became empty, their lands remained uncultivated, and their incomes declined. The aristocracy tried to resist these changes by enacting laws restricting wage growth and the movement of peasants. But these attempts were doomed to failure. Economic reality proved stronger than legislative prohibitions. Landowners who insisted on the old order simply could not find workers. Those who made concessions gained an advantage. Gradually, many feudal lords abandoned direct management of their estates and began to lease land to peasants for monetary payment. This was beneficial to both sides. The lord received a stable monetary income without needing to organize work, and the peasant gained relative independence and the opportunity to dispose of the results of his labor. A class of prosperous peasant tenants emerged, who hired laborers and managed their farms entrepreneurially. In the long term, these changes accelerated the transition from a land-based economy to a monetary one. Labor became valued more than land, which was a revolutionary change in a society where wealth had been measured by land ownership for centuries. It marked the beginning of the disintegration of the medieval economic system and the formation of prerequisites for the emergence of early capitalism. The guild system also underwent changes. Before the plague, guilds and craft associations strictly controlled production, limited the number of masters and apprentices, and set strict rules for training and production. After the epidemic, the shortage of artisans forced a relaxation of these restrictions. Training periods were shortened, and requirements for candidates were lowered. People without traditional guild education gained the opportunity to engage in crafts. This undermined the monopoly of the guilds and created preconditions for freer competition. Some sectors of the economy were particularly hard hit. The production of luxury goods declined. There was a shortage of both craftsmen and buyers. International trade slowed down due to the danger of travel and the closure of ports for quarantine. Many trading houses went bankrupt, unable to withstand the economic shocks. On the other hand, new opportunities also emerged. Land became cheaper, and enterprising individuals could buy abandoned estates for a pittance. Those who had capital and the courage to invest in uncertain conditions could become rich quickly. The structure of land use changed. Many fields, especially on poor soils, were abandoned and never cultivated again. Landowners shifted from labor-intensive agriculture to less demanding animal husbandry. Sheep farming for wool production became popular, especially in England. This required fewer workers and brought stable income due to the demand for wool from the developing textile industries of Flanders and Italy. The shortage of labor stimulated technological innovation. Labor-saving devices and mechanisms began to be used more actively. Water and windmills became more widespread, used not only for grinding grain but also for other purposes: fulling cloth, metal processing, sawing wood. Agricultural tools were improved. These innovations laid the foundation for future economic growth. Social mobility, which was extremely low in medieval society, began to increase. Surviving members of the lower classes had the opportunity to improve their status. Peasants became tenants or even small landowners. Artisans opened their own workshops. Merchants and entrepreneurs, who took advantage of the opportunities that opened up after the plague, accumulated capital and rose through the social ladder. This caused discontent among the traditional aristocracy. The nobility saw the blurring of established social boundaries and the enrichment of people of low origin who began to demand respect. In response, the aristocracy intensified the display of its high status. Fashion became increasingly extravagant and luxurious. Nobles wore complex costumes made of expensive fabrics, adorned with fur and jewels, to emphasize their distinction from commoners. Sumptuary laws were enacted, prohibiting representatives of lower classes from wearing certain types of clothing, jewelry, and using expensive fabrics and furs. These laws were intended to preserve the visible distinctions between estates, but they only underscored how serious the threat to the traditional hierarchy had become. If economic boundaries between estates had not blurred, there would have been no need to establish such strict rules regarding appearance. The contradiction between the growing economic importance of the lower classes and their low legal and social status generated tension. Peasants and artisans, realizing their strength and significance, no longer wished to tolerate the condescending attitude and restrictions imposed by the aristocracy. The aristocracy, in turn, did not want to share power and privileges. This clash of interests led to social conflicts and uprisings. The social tension that accumulated after the Black Death erupted into a series of popular uprisings that shook Europe in the latter half of the 14th century. Peasants and the urban poor, feeling their increased economic strength, were no longer willing to meekly submit to the old order. They demanded improved living conditions, lower taxes, the abolition of feudal obligations, and the recognition of their rights. When authorities tried to preserve the old system by force, riots broke out. One of the first major uprisings was the Jacquerie in France in 1358. Peasants in northern France, exhausted by the hardships of the 100 Years' War, the arbitrary rule of the feudal lords, and attempts to restore the old order, rebelled. The name Jacquerie derived from the derogatory nickname for French peasants, Jacques. The rebels stormed castles, killed nobles and their families, and burned estates. Years of accumulated hatred erupted in a wave of violence. The uprising spread over vast territories in Ile-de-France, Picardy, and Champagne. Peasant detachments numbered in the thousands. They lacked clear organization or explicit political goals. It was a spontaneous explosion of anger and despair. The rebels attacked noble estates, demanded the abolition of all feudal obligations, and the destruction of documents confirming the feudal lords' rights to land and peasants. In some places, they proclaimed the abolition of serfdom and the equality of all people. The nobility responded with brutal repression. Feudal lords united, gathered armed detachments, and mercilessly suppressed the uprising. Thousands of peasants were killed in battles or executed after their defeat. Villages that supported the uprising were plundered and burned. The Jacquerie was drowned in blood, but it showed that the lower classes were no longer willing to submit without protest. The memory of the uprising lived on among the people, reminding them that the patience of the oppressed is not infinite. In 1378, the revolt of the Ciompi occurred in Florence. The Ciompi were hired laborers in the textile industry, wool carders, who occupied the lowest position in the urban hierarchy. They had no right to form guilds, could not defend their interests, and worked for meager wages under arduous conditions. After the Black Death, when labor was scarce, the Ciompi tried to improve their situation. The revolt broke out in July 1378. The Ciompi and other dispossessed strata of Florentine society seized power in the city. They demanded the right to form their own guilds, participate in the city's governance, and receive fair wages. For a short time, they managed to achieve some concessions. New guilds were created for the Ciompi and other workers. But the ruling circles of Florence were not willing to tolerate the loss of power. Wealthy merchants and masters of the old guilds united against the rebels. They used economic leverage, political intrigue, and, ultimately, force to regain control of the city. By the end of the summer, the revolt was suppressed. The new guilds were abolished, their leaders executed or exiled, and the rights of the Ciompi curtailed. Florence returned to oligarchic rule. However, the revolt of the Ciompi remained in history as one of the early examples of hired workers fighting for their rights, a harbinger of future social conflicts in the industrial era. In England, in 1381, the largest popular uprising of the Middle Ages occurred. The Peasants' Revolt, led by Wat Tyler, also known as the Great Revolt. The pretext was a new poll tax introduced to finance the war with France. This tax was to be paid by all adults, regardless of their wealth, placing a heavy burden on the poor. Peasants, already outraged by attempts to legislatively limit wage growth and preserve feudal obligations, rebelled. The uprising began in Essex and Kent and quickly spread to other counties in southeast England. Peasant detachments marched on London. Wat Tyler, a charismatic leader who managed to unite disparate groups of rebels, rose at the head of the insurgents. Among the ideologists of the revolt was the priest John Ball, who preached radical ideas of social equality. His famous phrase, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" challenged the entire estate system of medieval society. The rebels captured London in June 1381. The young King Richard II, who was only 14 years old, was forced to meet with the rebels. The peasants demanded the abolition of serfdom, a reduction in rent, an amnesty for all participants in the revolt, and the punishment of corrupt officials and royal advisors. Richard promised to fulfill their demands, and many peasants, believing the king, began to disperse. However, at the next meeting, a conflict arose during which Wat Tyler was killed by the mayor of London. Left without a leader, the peasants were disoriented, and royal troops quickly took control of the situation. The revolt was brutally suppressed. The promises made by the king were revoked. Mass repressions began. Hundreds of participants in the revolt were executed. John Ball was captured and hanged. The authorities showed that they would not tolerate a threat to the existing order. Nevertheless, the uprisings had consequences. The authorities realized that the discontent of the lower classes could not be ignored indefinitely. Attempts to preserve the feudal system gradually weakened. In England, serfdom effectively disappeared within the next century, though it was not legally abolished. Peasants gained more rights and freedoms. The process of commutation, the replacement of in-kind obligations with monetary payments, continued and accelerated. These uprisings demonstrated that the social structure of medieval society was under severe strain. The old feudal system, based on personal dependence, subsistence farming, and rigid estate boundaries, no longer corresponded to the new economic reality. The Black Death became a catalyst for changes that had been brewing for a long time but could have taken centuries to unfold. The epidemic compressed time, accelerated historical processes, and made transformation inevitable and irreversible. The uprisings of the 14th century failed, their participants were executed, and their demands were rejected. But the seeds sown in those years would sprout later. The ideas of social equality, the peasants' right to fair treatment, criticism of aristocratic privilege, all of this did not disappear. These ideas were passed down from generation to generation, found new preachers, and inspired new movements. History showed that social change could not be indefinitely suppressed by force. Sooner or later, the old orders would crumble, giving way to new ones. The Black Death dealt a powerful blow to the authority of the Catholic Church. In medieval society, the Church was not just a religious institution. It defined worldview, explained the order of the world, gave meaning to life and death. People believed that the clergy possessed a special connection with God, that the prayers of priests could avert misfortunes, and that the sacraments of the Church ensured the salvation of the soul. When the plague struck Europe, believers turned to the Church for protection and explanation. But the Church proved as helpless against the epidemic as everyone else. Priests died as often as laypeople, perhaps even more often. Their duty required them to be near the sick and dying, to administer last rites, to hear confessions, and to give communion. This meant constant contact with the infected, and many clergy paid for their loyalty to their calling with their lives. Entire monasteries died out almost completely. In some abbeys, only 2 or 3 monks remained alive out of several dozen. Monastic life, involving communal living, shared meals, and joint prayers in confined spaces, created ideal conditions for the spread of the disease. The shortage of clergy became catastrophic. The church was forced to urgently ordain new priests, lowering the requirements for candidates. Young men who had barely received a basic education became priests after accelerated training. Many of them lacked sufficient theological knowledge, lacked spiritual experience, and did not meet the moral standards previously expected of the clergy. This inevitably led to a decline in the quality of church life and a fall in the authority of priests in the eyes of the flock. Moreover, many priests showed cowardice in the face of danger. Fearing infection, they fled from plague-ridden parishes, leaving believers without spiritual guidance. Chroniclers wrote with bitterness about priests who refused to come to the dying, who were unwilling to perform burials, and who cared only for their own salvation. Such behavior sharply contrasted with the ideal of a shepherd ready to lay down his life for his sheep. The people saw this hypocrisy and cowardice, and faith in the special sanctity of the clergy was undermined. Prayers and processions did not stop the epidemic. People prayed to saints, made pilgrimages to miraculous icons and relics, ordered masses, and made generous donations to the church. But the plague continued to rage. This gave rise to agonizing questions. If God is omnipotent and merciful, why does he allow such suffering? If the church possesses divine grace, why do its prayers remain unanswered? Perhaps the church had lost its grace due to the sins and vices of the clergy. Criticism of the church and clergy intensified. Many accused priests of greed, luxury, and immorality. The highest church dignitaries lived like secular princes, owned vast wealth, and engaged in political intrigues. Monasteries, which were supposed to be bastions of spirituality and asceticism, turned into wealthy estates where monks lived in comfort and idleness. The common people saw this discrepancy between the evangelical ideals of poverty and humility and the real lives of church institutions. The movement of the flagellants, mentioned earlier, was partly a protest against the official church. The flagellants asserted that a person could attain salvation through their own repentance and suffering, without the mediation of priests. They criticized the clergy for their inability to protect the flock from the plague, for corruption and immorality. Church authorities rightly saw this movement as a threat to their authority and began to persecute the flagellants. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement, calling it heresy, and urged secular authorities to suppress it. Heretical teachings that questioned church dogmas spread among the people. Some preachers claimed that the church had lost its right to represent God on earth, that the hierarchy and sacraments were not necessary for salvation, and that every believer could directly appeal to God. These ideas foreshadowed the Reformation, which would occur a century and a half later. The Black Death sowed the seeds of religious protest that would sprout in the 15th century and split Western Christianity. The church tried to maintain control over the minds of believers. It explained the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, called for repentance, and promised forgiveness of sins to those who remained faithful to the church. New holidays and cults associated with protection from the plague were introduced. Saint Roche and Saint Sebastian came to be venerated as patrons protecting against epidemics. New churches and chapels were built dedicated to these saints. The church attempted to turn the tragedy of the plague into an occasion for increased piety and its own influence. But a crack had already appeared in the foundation of church authority. People saw that the church was not omnipotent, that priests were as mortal as everyone else, and that prayers did not always help. This did not mean the immediate collapse of religiosity. Medieval society remained deeply religious, but the nature of faith began to change. It became more personal, less dependent on church institutions. People sought direct contact with God, read the Bible in their native languages, and created mystical and reformist movements. In England, John Wycliffe, a theologian and reformer, openly criticized the church in the 1370s. He denied the authority of the Pope, criticized the wealth of the church, and asserted that the Bible was the sole source of faith and that every believer should have access to Scripture. Wycliffe organized the translation of the Bible into English, which was a revolutionary step. His followers, the Lollards, spread his teachings among the common people, despite persecution from church and secular authorities. In Bohemia, Jan Hus, inspired by Wycliffe's ideas, also criticized church abuses. In the early 15th century, he preached in Czech, calling for church reform and a return to evangelical simplicity. Hus was accused of heresy and burned at the stake in 1415, but his death sparked a powerful protest movement in Bohemia, which culminated in the Hussite Wars. These conflicts demonstrated how deep the popular dissatisfaction with the church had become. The Black Death also influenced religious art. Before the epidemic, Christian art was predominantly optimistic, depicting Christ as the triumphant Savior, saints in glory, and heaven as a place of eternal bliss. After the plague, dark motifs appeared in art. The image of the dance macabre, an allegorical representation where a skeleton or the personification of death dances with representatives of all estates from the Pope and King to the peasant and child, became widespread. This image emphasized that death makes no distinctions, that all are equal in its face. Depictions of the Last Judgment became more dramatic and terrifying. Artists depicted the torments of sinners in hell, demons tormenting souls, and hellish cauldrons and flames in graphic detail. These images were meant to remind people of the inevitability of death and the importance of a righteous life. But they also reflected the trauma experienced by a generation that had witnessed mass mortality. The fear of death and the afterlife permeated the consciousness of the medieval person. Mystical movements, which sought direct spiritual experience and contact with God, gained new impetus. Mystics taught that the soul could unite with God through prayer, meditation, and spiritual contemplation, bypassing church sacraments and hierarchy. Figures such as Meister Eckhart in Germany or Julian of Norwich in England attracted followers seeking a more profound and personal religiosity. Church authorities viewed mystics with suspicion, seeing in their teachings a potential threat to orthodoxy. The plague also influenced attitudes toward death in medieval culture. Death ceased to be something distant and abstract. It became an everyday reality that everyone encountered personally. This gave rise to a special type of piety focused on preparing for death. Special texts on the art of dying, Ars Moriendi, appeared, which taught how to prepare properly for death, how to resist the devil's temptations in the last hour, and how to ensure the salvation of the soul. These texts were extremely popular in the 15th century. Attitudes toward the afterlife changed. The doctrine of purgatory, an intermediate state between heaven and hell where souls are purged of their sins, gained particular significance. People ordered many masses for the dead, hoping to shorten their deceased relatives' time in purgatory. The sale of indulgences, letters promising remission of sins and reduction of time in purgatory, flourished. It was precisely the abuses in the sale of indulgences that would become one of the triggers for the Reformation in the 15th century. The religious crisis caused by the Black Death did not lead to the immediate collapse of the Church. The Catholic Church remained a powerful institution for centuries more, but the epidemic exposed its weaknesses, undermined its authority, and gave rise to doubt and criticism. The seeds sown in the 14th century would sprout later and lead to profound religious transformations. The 16th century Reformation, which split Western Christianity, would have been impossible without the crisis of faith that began during the Black Death. The demographic consequences of the Black Death were unprecedented. Europe lost between a third and half of its population in a few years. The continent, which before the epidemic had experienced a period of population growth and even overpopulation, was suddenly depopulated. Cities turned into semi-empty settlements, villages disappeared, entire regions became desolate. It took centuries for Europe's population to recover to its 1,340 level. Demographers calculated that Europe's population in 1340 was about 75 million people. By 1350, it had decreased to approximately 50 million. This meant the disappearance of 25 million lives in 10 years. Some regions suffered even more. Italy lost up to 60% of its population in large cities. In England, mortality was between 40 and 50%. France, Germany, and Spain incurred comparable losses. But the epidemic did not end after 1350. The plague became an endemic disease, periodically returning to Europe for the next 3 centuries. Every 10 to 15 years, new epidemics broke out, although not as large-scale as the first wave. In 1361, there was a second major outbreak of plague, which claimed many lives. Then followed epidemics in the 1370s, 1380s, and 1390s. Recurrent epidemics did not allow the population to recover. Every time birth rates began to compensate for losses, a new wave of plague nullified these successes. Child mortality was particularly high. Children, lacking immunity, died more often than adults during subsequent epidemics. This slowed down demographic recovery. Only by the mid-15th century did Europe's population begin to grow steadily, and it took another 100 years to reach the level of 1,340. the population structure changed. The ratio between urban and rural populations shifted. Many peasants migrated to deserted cities, where there were better opportunities for earning a living and greater personal freedom. Cities, despite heavy losses during the epidemic, recovered faster and offered more prospects. This contributed to urbanization, which would become an important factor in Europe's economic and cultural development in subsequent centuries. The age structure also changed. After the plague, the proportion of the young population increased. Survivors actively gave birth, trying to compensate for losses. The average age of marriage decreased. Before the epidemic, in conditions of overpopulation and land scarcity, people often postponed marriage until they were 30. After the plague, young people could marry at 20 or even earlier, because land and opportunities for settling down were more accessible. This led to an increase in the birth rate. The sex ratio may also have changed, although data on this is contradictory. Some sources indicate that men died more often than women, possibly due to greater mobility and contact with the infected. Other sources do not record significant differences. If a disparity in favor of women did arise, it could have given them more opportunities in the marriage market and in the economy. Widows, who inherited the property of their deceased husbands, sometimes became independent heads of households, managing workshops and businesses. The geographical distribution of the population changed. Some areas became completely depopulated and were never resettled. Villages abandoned during the plague became overgrown with forest, and fields turned into wastelands. In England, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of so-called lost villages, settlements that disappeared in the 14th and 15th centuries. Some were abandoned due to the plague, others due to economic changes. When landowners converted arable land into sheep pastures, migration flows intensified. People left depopulated and devastated areas, moving to safer and more prosperous places. Within countries, there was a redistribution of the population. Survivors moved to large cities, where work could be found and a new life begun. Some areas that were densely populated before the plague became deserted, while others attracted new residents and developed. Changes also affected marriage practices. In conditions of demographic crisis, marriage restrictions eased. Widows and widowers entered into new marriages more quickly. Young people gained more freedom in choosing spouses because parental control weakened. Many parents died, and the younger generation was left to its own devices. Bastards, illegitimate children, more easily received recognition and rights because society needed every person to restore the population. The family structure also underwent changes. Large multi-generational families living under one roof became less common. High mortality destroyed traditional family ties. Orphans and children who lost their parents were raised by distant relatives or strangers. New forms of social ties emerged, based not on kinship but on neighborhood, professional affiliation, or shared interests. The demographic crisis influenced attitudes toward children. In medieval society, where mortality was high, and only half of those born survived to adulthood, attitudes toward children were often more detached. Parents could not afford to become too attached to their children, knowing that many would die. After the plague, this trend may have intensified. On the other hand, the awareness of the fragility of life could also have led to the opposite reaction, a more tender attitude toward each child as a priceless gift. The long-term demographic consequences of the plague were ambiguous. On one hand, the decrease in population led to an improvement in living standards for the survivors. More land and resources per person, higher wages, better nutrition. Some historians call the 15th century a golden age for European workers and peasants, when their conditions were relatively better than ever in the Middle Ages. On the other hand, the demographic decline slowed economic development in some respects. Fewer people meant fewer producers and consumers, a smaller market for goods. Some industries that depended on large-scale production declined. International trade decreased. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, fell into disrepair due to labor shortages and lack of funds for maintenance. However, in the long term, the demographic crisis stimulated innovation. The shortage of labor forced people to seek ways to increase labor productivity. New technologies were introduced, tools were improved, and natural resources were used more efficiently. These changes laid the foundation for future economic growth and technological progress that characterized the early modern period. The cultural consequences of the Black Death were as profound as the economic or social ones. The epidemic changed the worldview of Europeans. their attitudes toward life, death, God, and society. The optimism and confidence of the 14th century, when great Gothic cathedrals were built and scholastic philosophy flourished, gave way to the pessimism and anxiety of the 15th century. The world seemed an unpredictable and hostile place where death could strike at any moment. This mood was reflected in art. Painting became more somber and dramatic. Artists depicted Christ's suffering with graphic detail, emphasizing the physical pain of the crucifixion. Scenes of the Last Judgment showed the horrors of hell. In graphic detail, the genre of vanitas appeared still lifes with symbols of the transience and vanity of earthly life. Skulls, wilting flowers, hourglasses, extinguished candles. These images reminded the viewer of the inevitability of death and the futility of chasing earthly possessions. The theme of the danse macabre became one of the most popular in 15th century art. Series of engravings and frescoes depicted death, in the form of a skeleton, inviting representatives of all estates to a dance. Pope and beggar, king and peasant, young girl and old man, all forced to follow death. These images contained social criticism, emphasizing the equality of all before death and the vanity of earthly distinctions. They also reflected the traumatized consciousness of a generation that had experienced mass mortality. Literature also changed under the influence of the plague. Boccaccio's Decameron, written between 1350 and 1353, begins with a vivid description of the plague in Florence. 10 young people, fleeing the epidemic, retreat to a villa and tell each other stories. These novellas are full of life, love, cunning, and humor. They contrast with the grim reality of the plague from which the storytellers fled. The Decameron became a kind of protest against death, an affirmation of the value of life and human joys. Geoffrey Chaucer, in his Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, also reflected the atmosphere of post-plague England. His pilgrims represent different estates and professions, and through their stories, Chaucer creates a panorama of a society that has survived a catastrophe. In one of the tales, The Pardoner's Tale, death is personified and appears as a cunning force that deceives greedy people. Education and intellectual life suffered from the plague. Many scholars and teachers died. Universities, where students and professors lived in cramped student dormitories and colleges, suffered heavy losses. Oxford and Cambridge in England, the Sorbonne in Paris, the University of Bologna in Italy, all lost a significant portion of their members. The transmission of knowledge was interrupted, and unique manuscripts and research were lost. The restoration of intellectual life took decades. On the other hand, the crisis stimulated the creation of new universities. In the 14th and 15th centuries, new centers of higher education were founded throughout Europe, in part to compensate for the losses suffered by the old universities. Prague, Krakow, Vienna, Heidelberg, Leipzig, universities were established in these cities in the period after the plague. This contributed to the spread of education and culture in Central and Eastern Europe. The nature of philosophy and theology changed. The optimistic rationalism of the 14th century, represented by Thomas Aquinas, who believed in the possibility of harmony between faith and reason, gave way to more skeptical and pessimistic currents. Nominalism, a philosophical direction that asserted the limited capacity of human reason in understanding the divine, gained wide dissemination. William of Ockham and his followers emphasized the chasm between God and man, the inscrutability of divine will, and the rationality of faith. Mysticism, the search for direct personal experience of encounter with God, became a popular response to the crisis of official religiosity. Mystics taught that the soul could unite with God through contemplation and prayer, bypassing church sacraments and hierarchy. Meister Eckhart in Germany, Julian of Norwich in England, Catherine of Siena in Italy, these mystical authors found many followers among people disillusioned with the official church and seeking a deeper spirituality. The plague influenced attitudes toward medicine and science. The powerlessness of doctors against the epidemic undermined confidence in traditional medicine, based on ancient authorities. Some doctors began to seek new approaches based on observation and experience, not just theoretical reasoning. This was the beginning of a long journey toward modern scientific medicine. Doctors began to study the symptoms of diseases more carefully, keep case records, and try to identify patterns. Although the true nature of the plague remained unknown, the approach to studying diseases began to change. The first attempts at systematic epidemic control at the city and state levels emerged. Italian city-states were the first to introduce quarantine systems and isolation of the sick. Venice established special hospitals for plague patients on remote islands. Genoa and Milan introduced strict entry regulations during epidemics. These measures were not always effective but laid the foundation for modern public health and epidemiological control. Attitudes toward hygiene and cleanliness also improved. Although medieval people did not understand the role of microorganisms in disease transmission, they empirically observed that cleanliness helped prevent infection. Cities began to pay more attention to street cleaning, garbage removal, and water quality control. Public baths were built, although in some places they were closed during epidemics, mistakenly believing that baths contributed to the spread of disease. The plague also spurred practical innovations. The need for rapid burial of a large number of corpses stimulated changes in burial practices. Mass graves were created in specially designated areas outside the city walls. This was a departure from the tradition of burying the dead in church cemeteries near churches. The practice of creating separate cemeteries, away from residential areas, gradually developed, which had hygienic significance. Economic changes caused by the plague led to new forms of charity. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats who survived the epidemic often made generous donations for the construction of hospitals, orphanages, and almshouses. This was partly an act of gratitude to God for their salvation, partly an attempt to atone for sins and ensure the salvation of their souls. Funds were established to help the poor, orphans, and widows. A system of social assistance developed, a precursor to modern social welfare systems. The cultural landscape of Europe changed. Many artists, writers, musicians, and craftsmen died during the epidemic. Unique works of art, manuscripts, and knowledge were lost. On the other hand, the devastation opened the way for a new generation of creators. The 15th century saw the flourishing of the Italian Renaissance, a cultural and intellectual movement that transformed European civilization. The Renaissance was partly a response to the crisis caused by the plague. Renaissance humanists turned to the classical heritage, seeking in it an alternative to the dark medieval worldview. They emphasized the dignity and value of man, the beauty of earthly life, and the importance of education and culture. This was an optimistic view of the world, contrasting with the pessimism of the post-plague era. The Renaissance became a kind of revival, not only of classical culture but also of faith in man and his capabilities. Europe spent over a century recovering from the Black Death. Recurrent plague epidemics, wars, and social conflicts slowed the recovery process. The 14th and 15th centuries were a period of crisis and transformation. The old medieval world was collapsing, but the new one had not yet fully formed. It was an era of transition, full of contradictions and tensions. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337, continued until 1353. This long series of conflicts exacerbated the destruction caused by the plague. Armies plundered villages, burned crops, and killed civilians. France was particularly devastated. Its territory became a theater of hostilities. Entire provinces were ravaged by war and epidemics. The combination of war and disease created a vicious cycle. War spread diseases, and diseases weakened the ability to resist and recover. The political map of Europe began to change. Small feudal holdings consolidated into larger territorial states. Kings strengthened central power, subjugating rebellious vassals. Labor shortages and economic changes weakened the traditional aristocracy, allowing monarchs to strengthen their positions. The prerequisites for the emergence of absolute monarchies in the early modern period were formed. Cities gained more autonomy and influence. Urban communes and republics in Italy, Germany, and Flanders turned into important political and economic centers. Wealthy merchants and bankers played an increasingly significant role in politics. The Medici in Florence, the Fuggers in Augsburg, the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe. These and other trading houses and associations influenced the destinies of kingdoms and empires. Economic power began to compete with power based on land ownership and military force. Technological innovations accelerated. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge. Books, which previously were handwritten and accessible only to the wealthy, could now be mass-produced relatively cheaply. This contributed to increased literacy, the spread of ideas, and the development of science and culture. The printing press became one of the most important factors that prepared the Reformation and the scientific revolution. The great geographical discoveries of the late 15th and early 16th centuries opened a new era in European history. Christopher Columbus reached America in 1492. Vasco da Gama charted the sea route to India in 1498. These discoveries would have been impossible without the technological advancements in shipbuilding and navigation that developed in the 15th century. They were also stimulated by the economic changes of the post-plague era, the search for new markets, sources of wealth, and opportunities for enterprising individuals. The economic center of Europe began to shift. Italy and the Mediterranean, which were the heart of the European economy in the Middle Ages, gradually gave way to the Atlantic region. Portugal, Spain, and later the Netherlands and England became new centers of trade and maritime power. The discovery of America and the sea route to Asia shifted the main trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. This shift had long-term consequences for the balance of power in Europe. The 16th century Reformation was the culmination of the religious crisis that began during the Black Death. Martin Luther, who in 1517 criticized indulgences in the Catholic Church, expressed dissatisfaction that had been accumulating for centuries. His protest found a wide response because the ground had been prepared by previous generations of church critics. The Reformation split Western Christianity, giving rise to Protestantism and numerous religious wars. This marked the completion of a process that began with the crisis of church authority during the epidemic. The scientific revolution of the 16th century also had its roots in the post-plague era. A critical attitude toward traditional authorities, the search for new methods of cognition, and an emphasis on observation and experimentation all began to form in the 15th and 16th centuries. Nicolaus Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, these and other thinkers laid the foundations of modern science. Their work would have been impossible without the intellectual and cultural changes that began after the Black Death. The plague left a deep mark on European memory. Even after the epidemic ceased in the 16th century, the fear of the plague remained part of the cultural heritage. The phrase Black Death became a symbol of catastrophe, apocalypse, and mass death. The experience of the 14th century influenced how Europeans perceived and responded to subsequent epidemics and crises. In the long term, the Black Death paradoxically contributed to Europe's modernization. By destroying old structures, feudalism, serfdom, the boundless power of the church, the epidemic paved the way for new forms of social organization. The labor market became freer, social mobility increased, and individualism began to displace the collectivism of medieval corporations. These changes created the preconditions for the emergence of capitalism and the modern state. Some historians even argue that without the Black Death, Europe could not have escaped the Malthusian trap, a situation where population growth outpaces food production growth, leading to chronic poverty and starvation. The epidemic violently reduced the population, creating a more favorable ratio between people and resources. This allowed for an improvement in living standards, capital accumulation, and investment in technology. Such an interpretation may seem cynical, but it highlights the complexity of historical processes where tragedy and progress can be intertwined. The recovery was uneven. Some regions recovered faster than others. Italy, despite heavy losses, maintained its economic and cultural leadership in the 15th century. Florence, Venice, and Milan became centers of the Renaissance. The Netherlands, in the 15th century, became the wealthiest region in Europe due to trade and manufacturing. England and France, having recovered from the consequences of the 100 Years' War, began to build strong centralized states. Eastern Europe developed along a different path. Poland, Hungary, and Russia did not experience the same social transformations as Western Europe. Serfdom there did not weaken but, on the contrary, intensified in the 15th and 16th centuries. This created a development gap between Eastern and Western Europe, the consequences of which were felt up to the 20th century. The reasons for this difference are complex and multifaceted, but the demographic and economic consequences of the plague played a role. By the mid-15th century, Europe had finally recovered from the demographic losses of the Black Death. The population exceeded the level of 1,340 and continued to grow. The economy prospered, trade expanded, and cities grew. Europe entered an era that historians call the early modern period, a period of great discoveries, colonial empires, cultural flowering, and scientific achievements. But the memory of the Black Death did not disappear. It was preserved in folklore, literature, and art. The generations that survived the epidemic passed on their experiences to their children and grandchildren. This collective memory shaped European consciousness, reminding people of the fragility of human existence, the unpredictability of fate, and the equality of all in the face of death. Paradoxically, the awareness of mortality helped people to value life, strive for its improvement, create, and leave a legacy. The Black Death was the greatest catastrophe in European history. It claimed millions of lives, destroyed the familiar way of life, and engendered suffering and horror. But it also became a turning point that accelerated the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern era. The old world perished in the flames of the epidemic, but from the ashes emerged a new one, more dynamic, more open to change, more receptive to innovation. The story of the Black Death is a story not only of death but also of transformation, not only of an end but also of a beginning. Europe went through an agony and emerged from it changed, hardened, ready for new challenges and achievements.